As the affordability crisis continues to persist across America, I have a question that's timely and convenient considering the circumstances we're living in today. Why has homeownership become so difficult for an entire generation? We have to ask ourselves, is the American dream slipping away, or are outdated policies standing in its way of progressing forward? No matter where you come down on the matter, this episode of Let's Have This Conversation is distinctly designed for you to get a probing and accurate answer to that question, because I sit down with my friend David Rand. He's the host of Human Reaction and Build the Dream. He's a public policy leader and movement dedicated to drawing the necessary attention to one of the most societal prevalent issues of the day, the homeowner affordability crisis. Drawing on years of experience in public policy, strategic leadership, and grassroots advocacy, he explains why housing has become one of the greatest barriers to economic opportunity, family formation, and long-term financial stability. He doesn't approach the issue from a partisan lens. He offers thoughtful, solution-focused, and based discussions on things like zoning regulations, minimum lot size, parking mandate, and a restrictive permitting system have dramatically reduced housing supply, and at the same time, driven pricing beyond the reach of millions of Americans. He also takes some time to highlight some practical reforms already being implemented in states such as Montana, Florida, and Virginia, demonstrating communities can expand housing opportunities, reinstate affordability, and restore the path to homeownership without the reliance on heavy government intervention or costly subsidies. And Rand joined me this week to tell me more. I'm Kevin McShann. Let's have this conversation. If you're ready, I'll take a moment to welcome you to the program, and I'm super excited to learn all about the work that you're doing to try and make home affordability and access more accessible. It's great to see you, and happy Friday to you, my friend.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Kevin.
Absolutely. So, David, I wanted to start by asking you about the homeowner affordability crisis and the access to affordable housing and housing in general, because you say the American dream isn't dead, it's just blocked. And I'm wondering if we can start our conversation by you telling me why you hold that belief, my friend.
Yeah. So I've spent about 15 years in public policy at changing laws in my state here in the home state of Montana. And over that time, I've been working on, all kinds of different issues until I discovered housing affordability and what the policy barriers are to building more affordable housing. And fundamentally, it isn't so much that, we are building lots of housing, but just of the expensive variety, although that's some of the issue. It's really that we just don't build enough housing. We used to build a lot more every year, and at one point, we just stopped building quite so much. A lot of those reasons is because the government has made housing harder to build, more expensive to build, and therefore rarer to see in the new market housing in the marketplace. And what we're doing at Build the Dream is bringing light to that issue and helping people wrap their minds around why housing is so expensive, so that we can create the policy change to unblock the American dream again, and it can come back, and we can have housing affordability for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I know, David, that you describe yourself as someone who's drawn and driven to solve difficult problems by building teams and movements that create change from the ground up, my friend. So tell me, why are you deeply committed to creating, strategic continuity and clarity and solving big problems, my friend? Tell me more.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have always been drawn to work, to do any volunteer, do anything to be in a small group of people achieving something awesome. Right. That was when I was playing basketball. It was when I was playing basketball. If I was doing church work, it was doing church work. In my career, at one point I looked around and I needed to get a real job, have a real career. Otherwise, my wife wouldn't have married me. I found myself looking at public policy and politics as an area where I felt like there was a lack of leadership, a lack of people who are really in it for the right reasons. So I said, why not me? Why not give it a try? So I got my degree in poli-sci and philosophy. And, with this issue of housing, it's just like the things I've done previously. I'm just doing it on a bigger stage now. So back in 2020, I think it was 2023, 2021, sorry. I led alongside other groups that were, also important, and with the collaboration and obviously to support state legislators in reforming campus free speech in my home state of Montana. I did that because there was a huge problem going on our campuses with censorship. We got together a team, build a coalition of young college students of lots of different philosophical backgrounds to go to the state legislature and say, no, I know the administration, I know the colleges are saying one thing, but they're not telling you the truth. The reality was like this, and telling the individual personal stories that really mattered to legislators to sway their hearts and minds and help them wrap their mind around this issue of campus free expression. And with that, was able to pass 2 legislative bills that made a tremendous change in Montana's campuses to enable more free speech. I did that here in my home state, and Build the Dream is really just my effort to take housing affordability as an issue and build the same sort of thing, but larger, more massive, online-based, new media-based, young people-based, again, to reform housing in all 50 states.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm curious, David, in today's modern society, how do you think you look at the whole concept of personal liberty and individual choices? How do you think the concept of that has changed over the years, my friend?
How has it changed? So I think people see it primarily as an individual choice, right? Like as the things that individuals do, as opposed to an institution. The way that these norms evolved originally across the West and embodied in the Declaration of Independence and in our institutions in America, the way that we thought about how, who does what and how they do it, have been, contradictive. They've been all kinds of things, but there were the kernel of that core idea that there is no man who is by right by government better than any other man. That is a core fundamental belief. That was an institution. There were things built around that made it what it was. And so with the decline in the trust of institutions that we've seen the last 30 years, there's been, I think, a decline in the sense that freedom itself is an institution-based concept, that we need our formal protections embodied in government to protect our rights from government. And so oftentimes I find resistance to the things I'm trying to do because people say, well, that isn't how it's supposed to be. And they don't recognize that what we need are institutional protections from government, such as, for example, in housing reform. In housing reform, in order to get the freedom we need, the property rights we need, in order to create the prosperity we need in housing so that regular people can afford rent and then afford a house, we have to first change the government rules so they quit interfering with property rights. We have to secure those rights again with institutional security. Then and only then are we going to be able to get the success we want.
Yeah, and when we talk about homeowner affordability, we also have to talk about life affordability too. And I'm curious, how do you think those two things are interconnected, and how do they intersect to get more young people specifically to achieve the dream of home ownership? What are your thoughts there, my friend?
Yeah, there's many ways in which the economy has become generally more expensive. When you look at food, a recent AP report came out just recently demonstrating this explosion in food prices, which isn't well calculated by the CPI. The CPI is the Consumer Price Index. It's a basket of goods tracked over time by economists, really the Treasury, I believe, tracks these prices over time, and then they come up with complicated ways in order to try to reduce seasonal variability and these other things that always works in one direction, which is to make CPI a little bit less than how it feels. If you've been buying milk, man, milk is expensive now, right?
Yes,
why is that true? Now, and everything from milk to dairy to agriculture, when it comes to plants out of the ground, in food, we have all of these same problems built by progressivism, built by the scientific progressive revolution that changed the way our economy works circa between the years of 1890 and the 1930s. Over that period of time, before that period of time, largely things were based on a very radically laissez-faire market where the government did not play a large role in determining how much you could grow, how your food packing industry worked, all that kind of stuff. And that had downsides to it, downsides that hurt people 100%. Not justifying that the other way. So in order to solve that problem, what we did was centralize control at the FDA and other places that have made meatpacking, for a good example, exceedingly rare, meaning exceedingly monopolistic, and therefore the bidding price for packaging your meat has consolidated in the hands of fewer meat packers. There's great bills in the Congress to try to change this, such as the Prime Act. But it's another example of the same thing we've seen in housing, where there were challenges in housing. And then in order to solve those challenges, the government instituted these housing rules that consolidated power, took power away from regular people to develop housing, develop their land, build the business on their land, or have a business and a place to live in the same place, which is called mixed use. Took that right away from people and consolidated in the hands of experts who were supposed to plan and solve these problems for us. Well, the experts have failed. And that part of that institutional trust is people's intuition that fundamentally they have failed. Obviously, it's hard to live now. If it's hard to live, they haven't succeeded. Yeah, maybe we have solved some problems, but we have new problems now. And it's the cost of living problem that comes down especially hard on the youth. So to me, I think one of the first places we look at what are the results of the progressive revolution that made it so difficult in all these different elements, from money policy to agricultural policy we could talk about, to housing policy, that have driven up costs for regular people and made it difficult to afford a life.
Yeah, so let's talk about reshaping or restructuring the middle class and giving them a sense of empowerment. Empowerment, my friend, whether it's in life affordability or affordability of homes. How do you think we can re-empower the middle class to have a bigger voice in this discussion?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, the middle class makes up a tremendous amount of the voting electorate, but they largely do not see how the government is the thing that is making things expensive. Our monetary policy, half of everything you spend is determined by the price of money. What is the money inflation rate? So as the total amount of money increases, the total amount of dollars in the economy increase, so do the prices. And so now as a middle class person, you're constantly fighting for that next raise, because every year you're going to get that 3%, maybe 7%. It could be higher after COVID exploded way larger, to keep up with your basic expenses, right? So if we don't reform the money, it's very difficult to empower the middle class. So the way to empower the middle class is to return those decisions back to a setting of a monetary policy that is stable, that is not determined by a central cartel banking system such as it is now, and then doing the same things in other areas, such as housing, for example. It's hard to build a middle class without a housing affordability. Middle class often has been defined for your ability to access housing, that the housing that you want, right? Whether that's living in a condo, an apartment that you own, or a single family undetached. That's not what's relevant to middle class for me. How I would define it is as middle class means I'm able to achieve parts of the American dream that I want to achieve, be it that a condo ownership or affordable rent or an apartment building, but I can build that family life that I'm looking for. I can couple with another person and produce the future right? Those are the things that define a healthy middle class. And those are things that are determined by prices that are being fixed by experts in small groups of planning committees that define everything about our economy, almost everything about our economy. I don't want to overstate it. And so what you see is since 1971, the prices of some things have exploded. Education, something that defines the middle class, has exploded in cost. Well, we've used the government to subsidize it, and that's made it more expensive. And then we've used government to require it in more things, which makes it even more easy to charge larger rents to achieve the certification. And then across between housing to issues like food and issues like all the things that feed into your costs, rather than those prices being stable, they go up 3 to 7% a year. Right. So as those are happening, man, we can't build a middle class if we're constantly inflating away their ability to save, to stay out of debt, and to build their future.
Yeah, absolutely. And David, with your background in government and public policy, I'm going to ask you a very straightforward question, because if you look at the numbers, the confidence in government isn't exactly through the roof these days, no matter what side of the aisle you're on these days, my friend. So why do you think trust in government has eroded so much, and how can we get back to getting elected representatives who actually are interested in, solving societal problems of the day rather than their own partisan interests? How do we get back to a more unified government in terms of being a problem solver, my friend?
Yeah. No, that's a really great question and a difficult one. I mean, I wouldn't. The premise that you're advancing is that it is the inability of people to come together for solutions that has made people frustrated. I would suggest that actually it's the brokenness of our institutions that have made people frustrated, that they're frustrated the fact that life isn't getting easier, it's getting harder. Since 9/11, has anything gotten easier
Just
in the
more
economy?
just more expensive.
Yeah, just more expensive, harder to access. And that is across every level of government. Your local government is keeping you from building that apartment building that would allow more people to get a house, right? Get into affordable apartments. Your state government is adding new certifications every year to make getting a job harder to get. So for a good example, in my home state of Montana, veterinary technicians were always regular people who got an apprenticeship and then could become a veterinarian apprentice, right? To apprentice to a veterinarian, which required a degree. That was a way that you could get access to a well-paying middle-class job, not through taking on a bunch of debt, but just by showing up to work and being a good worker and learning on the job. The state government recently took that process and say, you can't do that process anymore. You now have to go to a veterinary school, take on debt, and do all these extra things in order to become a vet tech. Why? Because the veterinary technician schools lobbied the legislature, and the legislatures listened. So that's the question. It's our commitment to freedom that is the problem. If we believed in our institutions and our birthright to a free society defined by people being make good for each other and by themselves, we wouldn't have this problem in the first place. So to me, the way we get confidence in government back is we limit government and we open up regular people to solve more of our problems on the ground. When problems are solved, people will gain confidence again in our society and our systems. We can't solve problems because government is constantly getting in the way of regular people doing it on the ground. And the only way to do that is to be involved in the process, to be aware of what your legislator is doing. And that's what I try to do, is pierce that veil of what makes politics difficult, explain it to people, help people wrap their minds around it, and get engaged in the process.
Yeah, and to that point, I just want to buttress what you've been saying. A recent YouGov poll, David, found that only 26% of Americans today say that they've achieved the American dream, while 21% believe that they'll eventually get there, which is to your point, a drastic shift from just since 2009, when another CBS News poll found that roughly 3 out of 4 Americans believe that they either have or are on the precipice of achieving the American dream. Now, obviously, those numbers are drastically different. So I'm curious, why do you think so many people are losing faith in the American dream? And what's the key to restoring that confidence, my friend?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just imagine what has happened in that time frame, right? Decades of endless war. From 2009, the financial crisis, right? This is, during the financial crisis, just after, people are still feeling somewhat confident, but we are still, millennials still have not really recovered, if you look at the stats, from the financial crisis. Gen Z's walking into a situation post-financial crisis that really hasn't resolved itself. Why? Not because banks were greedy, not because individuals were greedy when they took loans that they shouldn't have taken, but because the system is broken. Our ability to connect savings to investment is completely separated by our monetary and fiscal policies. Additionally to that, when these things happened, rather than the government allowing the market to clear itself and allow all these bad actors to take a haircut, instead they came in with a troubled asset relief program and bailed everybody out, creating moral hazard. And then they came back around with the Dodd-Frank bill and made it easier to do the next bailout next time. So banks can speculate with your money even more so without any personal cost. So how do we, that's why people are pessimistic and getting more so? Well, right? Why are they getting pessimistic and more so? Well, geez, look at our politics to this day. A lot of people voted for this person or that person and then saw the opposite policy happen. From Barack Obama to Biden to Trump and back and forth, people are constantly disappointed by the people that are elected because it's not solving the underlying problem, because no one's talking about the underlying problem. We don't have a societal consensus. If we got that societal consensus, we all came together and said, hey, look, there are problems with every system, but I'd rather have the problems of freedom than the problems of all this government management that just can't get it right. Because obviously, the managers are just like you and me. They're regular people. They're not better than us. They're just regular folks who get a special badge and a special opportunity to rule the rest of us. We don't need them. We never did. All we need to do is get the power back ourselves to the people, and we could have a better society defined by that again, and more hope and ambition. I mean, the same generations we're talking about that are most pessimistic about the American dream then went through the pandemic. Right? 2009, they're just getting back on their feet circa 2020. And all of a sudden, a worldwide, once a generation, supposedly, pandemic comes along and completely upturns the apple cart on them again. So of course they are. And then what was the response? Destroying small businesses, destroying people's access to education, right? Like destroying families in this crazy culture war that resulted from it. Of course, that's how people feel after that experience. So how do we change that? Well, we got to change the way we respond to pandemics, and that hasn't happened. If the next one rolls around, we're going to do the exact same thing all over again, right? So until we actually change something at the level of our institution, of the level of Congress and the president, pass laws to protect the freedoms of Americans again, well, of course that's not going to happen, right? And people are going to continue to be pessimistic. But that can change. We can pass laws. All that requires is the accountability to do so, for regular people to care about the process again and to have a clear vision and can come together as a movement to say, no, this is the new standard. That's why I talk about housing so fundamentally, because it is, I think, the one thing that can do that across the left-right spectrum. When I passed a lot of these bills in Montana, I worked with the most conservative Republicans and the most liberal Democrats to do so. I'm not a partisan. All I care about is what does the ideas mean? What do the ideas entail? And do they empower regular people to solve their problems on the ground for each other? Or do they empower experts to rule us? Right. And if they do the former, I'm on board, and we can find ways to come together and make that happen across the partisan spectrum. And I think when we do so, that will re-empower people to see the future as bright again.
And David, we're less than 100 days from the midterms, and no matter what side of the island you're on, obviously policy reform is something that has to go under the microscope when it comes to housing, because David, I live in Canada, and I serve on the board of directors for Habitat in my hometown, and one of the biggest bottlenecks that we're seeing in terms of finding available places to build houses is land, my friend, the cost of acquiring land. So I'm curious, from a public policy perspective, how invested do you think people should be in who they're electing, how that affects housing, and for the upcoming midterms, how important is it for people to be engaged in that process, regardless of what side of the aisle you're on, my friend?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean the basic starting point for political accountability is knowing where your candidates are at on their issues, and this is true for every level of government, at least in the United States, and I imagine so too in Canada. I've run two large campaigns, one for U.S. House, well, it was statewide in my home state, and for U.S. Senate. I wasn't campaign manager, but I was part of the leadership team. And when I was doing that, if a regular person called our line, we were serious about answering that phone call and hearing what they had to say and really driving like, hey, if a lot of people called and said they want to hear us talk about this, well, gosh darn it, we better pull together a POV and start talking about that thing. That's all that's and if you start coming at it a very specific perspective that allies to their principles, that can change everything, right? So many things in this area of housing specifically does not change because of the perverse political incentives, because Republicans at least believe, and Democrats somewhat too, believe that the existing power base lies in a generation that already has their housing stuff figured out. And it's really about protecting their home values. But that's not necessarily true. The election in the United States for president was determined by boomers, but it had a large contingent of millennials who swung towards Trump that made the difference. And this is many articles written about the youth vote and then what that meant in that election. And that was part because of the promise that he would be a builder, who would allow us to build again. Right. So if you're calling up, no matter what side of the aisle you are, if it's a Democrat election, if you're a part of the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party, wherever you're at, as you're looking at your candidates, are you saying, are you going to enable us to build again? Or are you going to do more of the status quo? Right. And make them answer that question. And then when they take votes, otherwise, you say, you will never get my vote again. That's how our system works. And it requires that engagement. I know, and the engagement is tedious. It's difficult to do. But there are so many people who have exactly my same role to try to pierce this veil and give you the good information that you need to make these decisions out there on the internet. You can find them. I don't know about Canada specifically. Don't have anyone to recommend specifically, but across many jurisdictions and many places in America, that's true. So why not? What would it cost for you to make that phone call to your candidate and say, no, I want to hear you talk about housing more. How are we going to change this? And as a representative, as a leadership in the Habitat for Humanity, community, the charity that exists in this space is greatly hampered by our building construction rules. So asking your local government to change those rules is incredibly powerful because you're building the housing that people really feel like is needed for the low income folks. So, like that testimony, it's very few charities who actually do this work come in favor of our bills when we run them. So, showing up to testify to say, no, we need more freedom so that we can have more abundance so that housing and land can be cheaper when we're buying our materials and doing the things that we need to do to build affordable housing. Those are all possible possibilities. You swing potentially enormous amounts of political power when you speak up and do so.
Yeah, just to add on to your point. So last year, David, I attended something called the Building Bridges Summit on behalf of Habitat for Humanity International. And I found out something I didn't know because, depending on the state and the affiliate that you work with, in America, anyway, oftentimes up to 40% of funding for building affordable housing and the money that Habitat gets is controlled by the state legislature or the federal government. So if you piss off your federal or local government, it's harder for them to build houses because the government controls the money. And, to that point, a poll last year from the Pew Research Center found that 40% of American Gen Z millennials said that they can't afford the promise of owning a home. So I'm curious, what do you think it's going to take to not only remove the red tape for building more houses, but for Gen Z millennials specifically, and the role that government has to remove regulation so that more people have the ability to own a home. What are your thoughts there, my friend?
Yeah, so that really starts at I'll start the philosophical and I'll move to the policy. So philosophically, what we need to do is re-empower regular people, property owners, builders, consumers, to create the housing that they need on the ground. And that means more freedom of movement. So some of the individual policies I'd focus on in order to make that happen. Number one is what we call in the United States minimum lot size, but exists across many other jurisdictions internationally under different names. Effectively, what it says is when you're creating a lot, you got to make a lot that's bigger than this. Whatever it sets a floor on the size of your lot. By doing so, if you force large lots, it forces big buildings on large lots, meaning expensive housing on a lot of land. That process itself, just by making the lot smaller, can make housing much more affordable. If you look at Houston as an example of one, at least in the United States, it's a great example across all of social science. It's very rare to get an actual A/B test where someone does one thing and the other person does the exact opposite. We have a great control in America is that everybody embraced zoning and large lots all across from the 1960s all the way to today. Well, Houston never implemented zoning. And then in the 1990s, it reduced its minimum lot size substantially. And then in the early 2000s, it did it again in another area of the city. So both the outside and the inside of Houston, which is kind of like a donut shape, lowered their minimum lot sizes. By doing so, you're able to build smaller houses more abundantly on smaller lots. So what that means is that you're able to just have greater supply, which means cheaper houses. And to this day, Houston is one of the most affordable major metros in the United States, despite an enormous population, lots of monetary inflation, and lots of in-state and extra-state migration, meaning people are immigrating to Houston from both within the United States and from outside the United States. Houston remains one of the most affordable metros. We discover how affordable it can be by looking at Houston. So if you have an area that doesn't even have close to the in-state increase in demand and you lower your minimum lot size, you're going to see tremendous amounts of building of more affordable housing. That's number one. And that specifically targets both what I would call the middle, right? So we have single family homes on one side and we have large apartment complexes. When we have minimum lot size, it allows for smaller single family homes, which is really critical for your starter home, right? Because we effectively banned it. Get this. All right, get this, Kevin. In the 1980s, 40% of all new home construction in the United States were starter homes, meaning places that people could get into, right? That were about, a little less than a third of your total annual income in price. Today, it's 7%. 40% to 7%. We've completely collapsed our ability to build that kind of house, in part because of the rise of the minimum lot size. So we do that. We take care of that. That's smaller single family undetached, but we can also do townhomes, condominiums, and the row house, other kinds of housing that allows people to get into that initial start for a starter home. Second to that, you can't afford anything if you're constantly using your rent to pay for your rent, right? Or you use your income to pay for your rent. And to this day, right? So in the 1960s, about 20% of America were what we call rent burning. I mean, each month, 40% of their income is going to rent. Today, that's doubled to 40%. 40% of all renters today are spending more than 40% of their income on rent. And that's an average, meaning that there's many people to the right of that who are spending way more than that. For millennials, after the financial crisis, many millennials were averaging almost 50% of their income on rent. So we have to make rent go down if we're going to allow people to have the kind of economic prosperity that they can save up and they can make the investments required in order to have that down payment someday. If what we want to do that, we need to build more. So one of the things that we can do there's a bunch of other policies from allowing for ADUs, meaning accessory dwelling units, allowing that single family, to build that small second house on their land, small cottages, stuff like that, tiny homes, things like that, to, reducing single family zoning, right? So a lot of areas would do much better if they could build a duplex or a triplex or a quadruplex on a given chunk of land that's smaller in total footprint size, but the size of a single family plot. If you do that, you have a lot more opportunity to increase the total amount of rent. And then there's a lot of policies like single stair and others that I document on buildtheamericandream.org. You can get in and get a full policy breakdown on all these things. And I deliver it by video format, very consumable, very everyday language to the regular person to wrap your minds around these policies. So then when it comes up before the legislature, you're ready to make your testimony and heard too, so that you can pass these kind of policies that empower regular people to solve this problem, increase the supply, increase the amount of apparent rentals that are available on the marketplace so that we can have affordable rent again. When we build that, we'll have the opportunity to have more home ownership.
Yeah, it's important for people to stay engaged and activated, isn't it?
Yes, sir. 100%.
Absolutely. And David, I wanted your thoughts on this because the Mortgage Bankers Association of America said earlier this year that they believe as the baby boomers retire or leave the housing market on a full-time basis, that'll open up more opportunities for younger people to get in that housing market at scale. And I'm wondering your thoughts on this and what sort of common ground conversations do we have to have as a society so that more young people can afford housing and housing can become more affordable, my friend.
Yeah, yeah. So they call it the silver tsunami, right? This idea that as boomers get older, they're going to be exiting their single family homes and selling them on the open market. And that's going to allow a lot more people to get into an ability to buy a house. And that will mean a decrease in as that amount of housing on the market goes up, increases. You have increased amount of supply on the market for buying, that will mean a decline in price. I'm not so convinced by that. There are studies that have looked at this with more detail than just the kind of the large picture that I've said. And I think they're far more persuasive than the others. That's largely because most families are better incentivized to keep it in the family as an asset as long as things are restrained. Okay. So the perverse incentive that the government makes when it makes housing man-made scarce, meaning it's not scarce because there's just so much land, like if you're on an island or something like that, or it's not scarce because, oh man, no one can build there, it's too rocky, right? It's scarce because we've artificially said you can't build that here. You can't build the starter home. You can't build that townhome. You can't build that small apartment building because it doesn't have the geometry for 2 stairs. So if as long as we have that condition, the house is not a consumption item, right? It's an asset. And it makes more sense to keep that asset in the family than to sell it in the open market. So fundamentally, unless we change the way that we build housing and allow for easier entry to build new housing, we're going to see an older housing stock that has a deflationary price on its age and therefore less safe in many ways too, that will then result in a lot of people keeping that in the family and renting those places out, which means an increase perhaps in better rent, but not necessarily in better home ownership. So the silver tsunami will not solve this problem, I do not believe. And I think it's really, it's kind of fool's gold. Is specifically coming from the mortgage people. You got to watch out for that because one of the things they like the scarcity because that means that they can make more money on the mortgages, right? They like inflation prices. We don't like that. We don't want that as consumers, right? They have the opposite interest of us. So we got to be very careful with that kind of message.
Yeah, absolutely. And David, just because I'm personally curious, so I was born with cerebral palsy, and one of the reasons that I joined the board of directors for Habitat in my hometown was to advocate for the need to build more accessible housing for people with disabilities. And I'm wondering your thoughts on how we do that at scale for people with disabilities to also get engaged in this process because, as you know, both in the U.S. and in Canada, if you have a disability, it's very difficult to get a job, and if you make a certain level of income, then the government takes away some of the financial benefits that they afford to you. So how do you think we can let people with disabilities into the home ownership conversation, and how do you think we can provide them the income to live a sustainable life? What are your thoughts there, my friend?
Yeah, I think in the big picture, what you're talking about when it comes to welfare trap is a story that we've been telling ourselves. It's a problem. Sorry, it's a problem that we've been talking about since the 1970s. Right? You can find videos of Milton Friedman talking on Free to Choose in the 1970s saying there's this problem in welfare where if you make too much money, they take it away. So if you work, you make less money. It's a terrible disincentive to people. So how do we fix that? Well, that solution has been scaling in and not taking that away has been on the table for a very long time. We simply lack the political will to do anything about it. And politicians are risk averse because here's what happens when you say, well, we're going to allow people to work and keep their social benefits as they work. And people say like, well, you're spending too much money without really engaging in the full argument. All right. And so ultimately, this is a political problem that needs to be solved. I'm not sure if I'm the one to solve it. I don't know enough about the programs to really be able to tell you with a lot of detail, but I am aware of those arguments and how they played out in the legislature in my state. And as I've seen it play out dynamically across the United States. And it's crazy to me we haven't solved that yet. I'm so frustrated by the way we've contended with these issues. Next to that, though, I think when it comes to getting a job, all the labor market barriers are another one to look to, right? There's all kinds of ways in which people could be in productive labor and making a good wage, but we actually prevent them from doing so. Especially, I mean, one of the things that do that, especially amongst the least skilled or people who have disabilities, is minimum wage. That actually makes, someone who could have a job making less money, but they see that have a job, they would then have zero jobs because you can't charge the amount that they are able to produce. Because wages are paid on the marginal productivity of the laborer. So with that, and that's a technical economics way of saying basically that in order to employ somebody, you have to be able to charge a price to your consumer that you can then make up in the productivity of your laborer, who allows you to sell that thing. And if you set an artificial floor to it, it means that you can't employ that person if their productivity isn't high enough. But there could be many ways in which they could be productive and do things for a lower wage. I think addressing the labor market concerns are a real part of that problem. Addressing the way that social benefits work would be part of that. And as far as for more accessible housing for the disabled, I'm very open to how we solve that on the market. I think there are obviously common sense ways in which we do that, with ordinances, and I have no problem with that. If a locality wants to pass an ordinance to make sure certain features of construction, allow people to be accessible to the disabled, especially when it comes to, private businesses, commercial shops, things like that, I have no real challenge with that. I just would prefer it be done by ordinance and neutrally rather than by zoning. Zoning is usually kind of like a cleaver, while an ordinance is like a scalpel. And it's much more able to allow for those lines to be drawn that allows the entrepreneur to color in the rest of that and detail out what that means for their individual circumstance. And what I mean by that is the geometry of the lot, the way the business works, how we can do things on the ground, neutral rules that allow people to build what, depending on the circumstances, tend to solve things better.
Yeah, absolutely. And David, I've got 3 questions left for you. And the first of those 3 questions is this. We've talked a lot about zoning and regulations and the power of policy, but I also want to talk to you about the economics of construction, as we've talked about also outside of life affordability, the construction affordability has also gone up. So what we did in the past in order to build houses is becoming more expensive. So how do you think we can lower the cost of not only building houses, but acquiring the materials that it'll take to build houses at scale, my friend?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so part of that is going back to the money. Copper is a metal that people will buy in order to hedge against inflation. If you're buying copper for investment, and holding it someplace, is not being used to wire a house, right? So if we have less inflation, we have more stable monetary policy. We will have a little bit better copper prices, I suspect. And the other one is, there are other competitive goods that are also buying up lots of copper, and especially in this current age, that are competitive on the marketplace to that. Another one is lumber. When you look at lumber, we have an interesting thing, especially interestingly talking to you from Canada. Canada has done a great job in reforming the way that they do their public lands. Much more Canada lumber is actually being used in the United States today. That if you're Canadian, that means the lumber that would have made it cheap in Canada is being driven down by exporting it to the United States. So it's increasing your price domestically. Now, one of the reasons why that happened is because the United States has been so terrible at the way that we manage our lands in the West in the United States, where, for example, in my home state, when my dad was a kid, we had about 40 lumber mills in the state of Montana. Today, there's like 3. So we used to pull lumber out of our forests, mill it here in the United States, and then sell it on the market here. And now we can't do that, in part because the U.S. Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, and other federal land and forest policies. So we've shut down our lumber production in the United States, and that means that there's a scarcer supply, thus driving up the price of lumber, making it far more expensive than it used to be, even more so than inflation. So the general inflationary level is part of that, like the cost of goods and materials in the structure of production get more expensive when you inflate the money. But also we've placed policy barriers that made it harder to actually produce the things that produce houses. So if we change those policy barriers, such as reforming the way that we do land, much like that they have done in Canada, we'll have more supply, more competition in that market, and Canadian lumber suppliers will have a better reason to drop their price and be more competitive.
Yeah, absolutely. And David, when I visited Habitat International last year for their building produce summit, one of the things we did was we had something called a common ground dinner where we talked for about 2 hours about the challenges facing housing and the perception of Habitat and what the charity does. So I'm curious, taking the model of a common ground dinner when we're talking about either building houses, housing affordability. If I asked you to host a common ground dinner about housing policy and governmental policy, what are some of the issues that you think that the modern consumer needs to know about the housing policy conversation, my friend?
That you want to know what the consumer would need to know specifically.
Yes, essentially, yeah.
You know, yeah, that's a question. That's an excellent question. So like broadly, the way I see it is everyone's a consumer in the housing market. Everybody, right? It's the one thing which is universal. We all need access to food, water, and shelter, right? So it's the same issue. It's the same way I talk about it to the general public. Honestly, the general public need to reframe the way they see housing. Too many of us see it as like some natural phenomena. Like the housing is expensive as if it was like a tsunami made it so, or it was like an earthquake and it just suddenly got more expensive because that's what happens, right? That's not true. It is expensive for specific reasons related to government policy. If we change the policies, it can become affordable again. So that's the broad part of it. And then of course I detailed a lot of the policies already detailed to you today, but that underlying issue is like, the reason why I say the American dream is not dead, it's only blocked, is because the blocking is what killed it, right? Made it feel killed. But all the underlying things are still there. The builders are still there. There's still people who want to put up more affordable housing, but they can't. They're not allowed to, right? If we just unblock it, we can return the American dream. We can return housing prosperity back to the American people, and we'll be able to, have the kind of future planning and stability that people are looking for. And because that's really it. I mean, we did a poll. It said 66% of Americans say that housing costs have made it harder to build the kind of life they want. That's what we were promised in the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence. This idea that there is a thing that everyone is going for. And a lot of them are defining it right now. When we ask them is how would they define, what they want of the housing market, it was just stability. The ability to just afford rent this year, get that raise, and not to have it immediately sucked up by rent again. That sense of I'm on a treadmill and the treadmill just keeps going faster and I don't know if I can run any faster. That sense financially like that can be changed because that isn't a result of something natural. That is something that man made. And if man made it, man can unblock it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, David, my final question for you has to do with centering around the whole concept of prosperity and legacy building. So when you look at the concept of housing prosperity in this modern age, my friend, how do you think it can be redefined or reimagined to fit the more modern definition of what it means to have housing prosperity? And then lastly, I'm interested in how you want your own personal and professional legacy to be defined, my friend. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I talk a lot about the family. I'm a more conservative person, right? I'm from a rural place. I am extremely square. And the way I see it, if we've created every economic incentive for people not to have a legacy, to not have children, to not couple, to when they do couple, they couple way late, where children are far less likely to happen or more likely to happen with complications. We've created an entire social structure around that and even justified it and said, like, this is the new way we're doing things, rather than looking at the incentives that create that situation. In America, we largely say, hey, you can have kids once you've bought a house, and then we made housing impossible to buy. Right? So why aren't people having kids? That's why we have this enormous collapse in our birth rate. Will people have a legacy if they don't have children? What will it mean? What will it mean for the everyday person to not have anyone who remembers them when they die? So like you have that sociological challenge of like what to do with that. When it comes to people who don't want to have kids, and I understand some people can't or won't or whatever, and I get that. I'm not saying that doesn't mean you can't have a legacy or whatever, but I think for most people that's where that happens. It happens on the level of the family. And by making housing so artificially scarce through all these government rules, we are eliminating the family. That's why birth rate has collapsed from 2.2, 2.5 down to 1.8. And in some states in America, it's down to 1.5. Right? With that low of birth rate, that means our societal systems will collapse. We will not exist as an American, as a society, with the values that we have today, or anything representing the values that made us who we are with that birth rate. So what do we do about that? Well, I think housing and affordability is the crux of that. If we make it another one, we effectively eliminated the apartment building where you can have a couple that has a kid. Right. So right now, only about 50% of all apartments are studios and one bedrooms. Right. So with that huge rate of almost over half being that means very relatively few people are going to be able to get access to that one place with their spouse while they're still renting before they have that down payment saved up and have their first kid. That means they have to delay. As they delay, that means things get later. As things get later, you get less fertile, and then you have less kids. Right. So we don't build what the market demands. What the market is demanding is all kinds of other things. Right. If you're down to selection and everything else, there's so many ways in which the economics informs and creates the social conditions that everybody hates. Everybody's upset about every single day. I open up Instagram and I see people who are upset about it. Right. How they can't find a spouse, how they can't have kids, how they can't afford it. So when it comes to that, the building of a legacy, the building of prosperity, what it means to actually have something. Well, man, I can't guarantee a society or a future where everyone's a millionaire. But I can say is that you can create a society, and I know this because we used to have it, where regular people are able to find meaningful relationships, meaningful coupling, and a meaningful future through children. And allow for that social cohesion to pull together as a community to happen from the bottom up, not by it doesn't impose from the top down, from regular people deciding that it cares and it matters. Right. So those sorts of things happen in part because we centrally plan all these things. We keep people separated from where they otherwise would be. A lot of people who should be in apartment buildings are not in apartment buildings because we made them artificially scarce, or vice versa. So there's so many ways in which we've created social outcomes out of public policy, but we don't see the public policy at all. We bring that to consciousness. We can solve that. And so what does it mean? How do we redefine it? I don't know if we can redefine it or what that even would mean. The things that we talk about when we talk about the legacy in the past is in part at least informed by the continuity of our past, the legacy for the future is informed by the continuity to the past, who we are, what our last names are, where our family comes from, right? And we lose that when we have small towns that are completely destroyed because people have to move out of them because it's too expensive to live there now, and all of those collateral social consequences. So, to me, it is, I don't know what it looks like until we solve this problem of housing reform, until we can get the place where we remove the man-made scarcity and discover the natural scarcity that exists in the marketplace. And, your part about my personal legacy, man, all I want to do is in my time, do the best that I can to make the world as good a place as I can for my children. That's all that matters to me. Everything else is just, it's just, sinew and dust. It's all just drama. Everything beyond that is how can I in my time try to do the best I can to make the world a better place? You know, and if that is what it is, that's great. You know, will it be a big, trust fund for my kids? Probably not. I run a nonprofit, bro. It's not going to happen. But will it mean like maybe being a guy that they can say stepped up and had heroic values and did the thing that was difficult, even though, or unlikely because it was the right thing to do, because it was the thing that might have worked. Man, I'm going to take that chance every time.
Yeah, absolutely. And my friend, finally, that way, if people want to get connected with you, the good work you're doing around housing affordability and housing policy, what's the best way they can do that, my friend?
Yeah. Check out buildtheamericandream.org. That's our main website. That's our home. We push everything there. But also, I mean, if you're more into short form content, find us on Instagram, Build the American Dream. Found us on X at Build the Dream. We also have a YouTube page, Build the American Dream. You could just look at us and find us anywhere on Google. We're searchable to get connected, check out our stuff, do weekly content that reveals all this stuff, talks about it every week, breaks it down for regular folks to kind of wrap their minds around and get activated and get understanding how we can make the world a better place.
Well, fabulous, my friend. I want to thank you for your obviously committed passion and dedication to the space of housing policy, affordability, and access, my friend. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I want to thank you for being here and engaging in conversation. It's most appreciated.
Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate it.